بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله ثم ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum. This is session 2, and here we will continue to treat the methodology of the scholars of Azhar, or the Azhari methodology. In this session, we will introduce the concept of forming an information network, or تكوين شبكة معلومات. So this idea was introduced by Dr. Ali Juma to a group of students some years back. And the concept is very effective to understand that we need to formulate an information network which will guide our thinking. But how do we do that? What the Sheikh says is that we approach a linguistic investigation. So what we do is we take a word and then we investigate that word. The goal or the objective of such an endeavor is that we want to understand the meaning of that term, and then we want to understand how it is that concepts are formulated from those meanings when they interrelate to one another, because a concept is really a network of meanings that are interrelated, and then an overall understanding. That overall understanding of those different meanings or those different terms formulate what we call a concept. So we want to understand meaning and concepts and how they interrelate, because we may have a group of meanings here in this section that we're treating, and that group of meanings formulates a concept, and then we have another set of meanings over here in another science, so to speak, and this formulates another concept, and then we want to see how this concept relates to this concept until we build up an overall system of understanding. When we understand the relationship between the different sets of meanings and the relationship between those sets of meanings and the concept that they form as a whole, and the relationship between this concept and this system over here, which is composed of a set of meanings which are interrelated, which, when composed together or looked at as a whole, form another concept. So when we see concepts and how they relate to one another, and when we understand how those concepts are formulated, that's when we begin to develop a network or a system for understanding, an information network or a shabaka. So he uses the example of the term fiqh to illustrate this concept. When we look at the word fiqh or fiqh, we look at it from the perspective of the Arabic language. So we will look at the word to see its different forms, and in understanding its different forms, we may get some sense of what the word indicates to. But when we come to the core meaning of the term, we find that in the Arabic language, there's three meanings for the word fiqh. It means to comprehend the intention of a speaker. It means to understand matters that are abstract, not matters that are known as matters of fact, but matters that are abstract that require thought. And it also means understanding without qualification, just understanding, comprehension. This is the linguistic meaning for the term fiqh. So then we see that the term is interrelated in its meanings by the notion of comprehension. But we see that there are slight differences in each meaning. Each meaning carries a significance which is unique to itself but interrelated or pointing to the other meanings. Then we find that once we understand the linguistic meaning, we look at the term from a terminological perspective. Now, technically speaking, number 3 means that we look at the Shari'i meaning or how the word is used in the Quran and in the Sunnah. But for the sake of simplicity, let us go to the terminological meaning. Logically speaking, though, we would treat Shari'i meaning first before we would treat terminological meaning. But not every term has a Shari'i meaning. We find that some terms have a linguistic meaning and a terminological meaning. And what that means when we talk about a terminological meaning is that a term or word is given definitions by scholars. And these definitions are not just assigned to a word, but there's a scientific debate which is engaged in order to try to arrive at an appropriate meaning for that term. So in fiqh, we come to understand that fiqh, terminologically speaking, basically for the sake of simplification, we say that it is knowledge of one's obligations to Allah in matters which can be halal or haram. Simply put, there's an obligation there, and it may be an obligation to do or not to do. Now, if we were to go to the fiqh books, there's a more of a detailed description of what fiqh means terminologically, but for the sake of simplicity, we will suffice with this. Now, we also find that Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, he gave the term fiqh 3 different meanings, and he assigned those meanings as follows: that fiqh has a greater understanding, an intermediate understanding, and a primary understanding. The greater understanding is that knowledge which we call aqidah or creed. The intermediate understanding is the sciences of the heart, so understanding how we should engage the heart in order to achieve purification of it, or a state of purification, spiritually speaking. And the primary meaning is that we understand the knowledge of the halal and the haram as it pertains to actions. So Imam Abu Hanifa himself gave the term fiqh these type of meanings: fiqh al-akbar, fiqh al-awsat, wa fiqh al-asghar. But we also find that Imam Abu Hanifa's terminological meaning has a Shari'i basis. Why? Because Imam Abu Hanifa broke fiqh up into 3 parts and gave each part a terminological meaning, and we find that those 3 parts relate to the concepts of Iman, Ihsan, and Islam. When we look at the Shari'i meaning for the word fiqh, we find the hadith that's Sahih, narrated by Bukhari in his Sahih, and Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi used to recite it before engaging in his class. مَن يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهْهُ فِي الدِّينِ. So the term fiqh is used in the concept of comprehension of the deen, or the way of submission to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So when we look at the Shari'i meaning, when we look at the terminological meaning, when we look at the linguistic meanings, we come to an understanding of how these different levels of meaning interrelate to one another. So we carry with us then these different senses. We carry with us these various levels of meaning, and we see how they interrelate to one another, and we see how at every level of meaning here, fiqh has something to do with comprehension, has something to do with understanding. But exactly what that understanding is will be colored by what fiqh relates to. So this would be considered a starting point for any investigation. So if we were to take another word, such as aqidah, and break it down in this manner, alongside the term fiqh, then we will have 2 terms that we will understand at various levels. Now, What that gives us an insight to is that if we're dealing with a particular science, we want to see all the words which are related to a particular investigation. So, for instance, if we're doing an investigation in the fiqh purification or the fiqh tahara, then we want to understand what the word tahara or purification is. We want to understand what wudu means. We want to understand what ghusl means. We want to understand what istinja means. We want to understand what haid means. Once we understand all those terms in this light, then what we begin to have is an understanding, which is an understanding of a series of concepts which interrelate to one another. So when we understand them at the level of the Arabic language and at the level of how the scholars use those terms, and maybe if there's a basis for it or there's a usage for the word in the Quran and the Sunnah, then we begin to have an insight into how this term is to be applied, how it's to be used, and in what context is it appropriate to use the term. As far as a science is concerned, we would begin to understand to see how the term relates to other terms and how those terms altogether form a body of terminologies which are governed by an overall concept. So when we have that, in this case, we call that a science. To understand the way that meaning is constructed, to understand the terms which are generated from those various meanings which are constructed, to understand the relationship between those different terms, and to understand the overall concept which weds those terms together. That's when we have formed an information network, and that's when we come to understand the identity of a particular body of knowledge. Now, a term may be used in one body of knowledge in one way, and the same term may be used, or the same word may be used in another body of knowledge in another way. And scholarly principle dictates then that we understand the subtleties of context. What I mean is that we understand the way that the term is being used in one system versus another system. We don't want to collapse the meaning of the terms and confuse what they indicate, to confuse what they mean. We want to respect the boundaries of each term and respect the way those terms are used. And once we do that, then we begin to have a scientific, principled, scholarly approach to texts and to ideas and even to philosophies and to the way knowledge is constructed. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.